Again, we are honored to be joined by another speaker today, and that is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. And members, I was blown away when I heard this gentleman speak, a few years ago now, and he's done it all. I'm gonna try to read you his bio as quickly as I can. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser is the founder and the president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. He is a devout Muslim and a former lieutenant commander in the United States Navy. He is a nationally recognized expert in the contest of ideas against political Islam and American Islamist organizations. Dr. Jasser regularly briefs members of Congress on the threat of political Islam and has been called to testify on the issue of Muslim radicalization in the United States. He has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Washington Times, New York Post, Dallas Morning News, CNN, everything you can think of. He has spoken at hundreds of national and international events, including universities, places of worship, government venues, and in the past year, he has spoken at the Hudson Institute's The Peril of Global Intolerance, the UN, and Durban 3, the U.S. Strategic Command's 2011 Deterrence Symposium panel, as well as the National FBI Executive Institute, on Whose Voice Are You Listening To? Dr. Jasser is a contributing writer to a number of books and the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam and American Muslim Patriots Fight to Save His Faith. He is featured in 4 documentaries, and he is going to brief us on the current state of affairs of maybe global terrorism, maybe how it might affect our state, and so much more. And Dr. Jasser, he's just came back from Washington a couple days ago, so we very, very much appreciate you fitting us into your schedule here. But without further ado, I'd just like to turn it over to you. I think we're going to have a slideshow as well, members. And thank you, Dr. Jasser. Please proceed.
Thank you, Senator Smith. It's an honor to be here and share some time with you. And hopefully this is just the beginning of a conversation. Just to clarify for time, we're still okay with the 20 minutes? Am I? Okay. Again, I would make as much time as I could to speak to you because our organization started in Arizona. It's based in Arizona. And while we're doing national, even global work now, we formed after 9/11 as some concerned Muslim families that felt that this war against terror, as it was called, was simply a tactic that ultimately you can't defeat an enemy that you don't try to deconstruct their ideology. So we felt that this was a Muslim problem that needed a Muslim solution, and we confronted what we felt were the ideas. And back when we formed, our mission statement in 2003 was the separation of mosque and state, because it wasn't about counterterrorism, it wasn't about countering tactics, but the separation of mosque and state. And I think since ISIS formed, the Islamic State, as they call themselves, it validated that this is the problem. And now, 15 years later, almost since 9/11, I think the world is waking up to this conflict that creates the threat that all of you deal with. And before I get into the presentation, I want to also congratulate Colonel Milstead, and we look forward to working closely with DPS and our frontline folks who try to, on a granular level, keep us safe. But I think if you don't understand the bigger picture and have a picture of understanding what it is from 30,000 feet, 70,000 feet, I don't think you can keep us safe on a granular level. Nobody's saying that we need to make laws against certain beliefs or try to ratchet things back. We are a free-minded liberal organization that believes that you don't need to sacrifice freedom in order to promote security. And I know Senator Ward's question before about privacy is very important. But yet when I've testified to Congress, a lot of the issues come up and this issue gets politicized very much so, and it prevents an ability to actually deal with the problem. It was nice to see a unanimous bipartisan support on public safety, and I hope on this issue we can do the same thing in moving forward. Basically what I wanted today is, I know right now the mantra in Washington is about countering violent extremism. When DPS and others get together, fusion centers, it's all about finding those violent extremists. From a practical level, how do you fight attack? That's a tactic. How do you identify what that is? Basically, you're waiting for that individual to ultimately have a plan that he or she wants to act out, and it's often too late. That's why now it's the largest agency in government, because you have to spend a lot of money to work on just fighting them in that last moment right before they commit that act. That's the legal fight. I think if you understand the ideology, you can do better policing. While a minority of Muslims believe in the ideology of Islamism or political Islam, we can't deny that every radical Islamist is a Muslim. So if you spend all of our money in dealing with all the other groups and organizations that are violent extremists or whatever it is, that is not going to solve the problem. And I think smart law enforcement needs to understand what that is. So the root cause ideology is militant Islamism. I hope we can understand that. Law enforcement, by better understanding, you can better follow cases, behavior, cells, gangs, and radicalization. And that radicalization doesn't happen overnight. You know, in my book, one of the primary chapters is about Nidal Hassan. Nidal Hassan was a Fort Hood psychiatry officer, a major, who has a bio, sadly, very similar to mine. And yet, he ended up becoming our country's worst enemy, committing an act of terror. He was not radicalized overnight. He was seeing patients at Walter Reed, handing them cards that said "Soldier of God." He was giving presentations to Bethesda Naval and Walter Reed about jihad that were sort of odd, but nobody said anything because they were worried about political correctness. I hope that doesn't happen again, because yes, we don't want to take away their rights to be free, but the ultimate issue is probing and being able to follow behaviors. He was communicating with Al-Qaeda with his mentor, Imam Awlaki, while he was in Yemen abroad, and yet that wasn't being monitored. And I think that is a severe problem. And by the way, his mentor was also radicalized in America, an American-born, who we then had to assassinate with a drone in Yemen, I think very appropriately. ISIS exists in all 50 states. The head of the FBI said that recently, and it is a threat that we have to deal with. It's growing. It can come through the border. It can come homegrown. We see even women being radicalized now, going off to be part of this global jihad with ISIS. And if there's one thing I leave you with, I hope you can understand how that process happens. And I can tell you as a Muslim, this is something we are grappling with, is how do we, how do we protect our youth from being pulled into these movements? And I think at its essence is, there's a denial that exists, is that this is not Islamic, it's just a militant movement. But there's the peaceful Islam that is there on the left that we pray and worship, that we believe is core, that first freedom, that's American, which is to practice our faith. And then there's the militant Islam. And I think ultimately to deny that that is a version of Islam that is theocratic, that is oppressive, that includes gender apartheid, militancy against other faiths and minorities, I think is a denial that is very dangerous. And the population of Muslims in the world, this is not a small problem. A quarter of the world's population is Muslim, and these countries that are dark green are the ones that are Muslim majority, but ultimately you're talking about 1.6 billion people. So this is why you have to engage Muslims in this process, and I think unfortunately when we look at resources, there has only been a very monolithic approach to the Muslim issue, if you will, and that is those voices in Washington that are apologetic, that are in denial, and say that any type of approach to the theocratic ideas is Islamophobia or bigoted against Muslims, when in fact, if you want to get reformists engaged to counter that continuum of radicalization, you have to engage reform-minded Muslim groups, and I'm going to give you a list of some of us that exist. I think if you look, the Arab awakening has been an opportunity. While it has created, I use the analogy of a pressure cooker that's been opened, and you have everything exploding because this pressure cooker has released the pressure of dictatorship that existed in the Middle East for decades. And the sad thing is that this opportunity is being lost, and these vacuums in the Middle East with change from dictatorship are being filled by even more radical militant elements, and I think it's because the West has not been engaged in this process. And you don't have to be engaged abroad. This is where I think local Muslim communities can be so pivotal. We can do the work against theocracy here in America, countering some of these groups that are, when you have kids in Arizona or Colorado or elsewhere being pulled into ISIS, the way to pull them away from that into American patriotism versus Islamo-patriotism, the Islamic jihad for that Islamic state, those two poles where you want to teach a Muslim kid in America to want to rather die for America and liberty than rather die for ISIS. That's the conflict. It's not about violence. The violence comes at the end when they realize they have the keys to heaven, supposedly, by doing that. The militancy the ideology is countered by patriotic, pro-liberty, pro-freedom movements that recognize that America is not just about foreign policy and other things, it's about liberty and freedom to practice your faith. And this is something we haven't operationalized. And I think this is obviously a battle within the House of Islam. There was an op-ed in the New York Times yesterday that, well, we can't deal, the Western Homeland Security apparatus can't begin to get involved in an intramural debate within Islam. Well, I think this is, as I testified to Congress in 2011, this is an inherently American battle. Our country was founded by devout Christians who wanted to revolt against theocracy. So why we can't empower Muslims who want to fight and revolt against theocracy is beyond me, and I don't see why we can't do that. To say that the enemy is theocracy, because to say that ISIS comes out of thin air is extremely problematic and will be a major, and has been a major liability in our homeland security. There are ideas that radicalize Muslims that aren't about violence, that are about demonizing America, demonizing this country as being Islamophobic, bigoted against Muslims, and countries that we consider allies, like Saudi Arabia and other countries that have billions that they've spent on demonizing America and also promoting the ideas. ISIS's ideas are basically Saudi Arabians' government ideas. Saudi Arabia beheads individuals for violating and offending Islam. Women have virtually no rights, and there's significant gender apartheid in that country. So you have countries, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Iran, that are boot camps for ISIS, that then fund and actually radicalize these groups and spread these ideas across the internet and go into our homes here in Arizona. And if we don't develop programs like we did in the Cold War to have Radio Free Islam, Radio Free Middle East, that comes from ideas here in America against theocracy, we are never going to win this war. And we're going to continue having what I would say, DPS and others do is a whack-a-mole program. You're going to continue to try to figure out where the next one's coming from with no project for advancing it. And the current groups that we're using in Washington, and they have the freedom to represent Muslims as much as they want, but currently it would be like in the Cold War, bonding with the non-Soviet, non-violent communist groups in America and saying that they have the way to combat Soviet ideology because they're not part of the imperialist structure, but they still believe in communism. I'll tell you, as an American Muslim that believes in liberty and our founding principles, Islamism is not compatible, and there's a diagram I want to show you in a second. If you understand Islamism, I think you begin to understand the threat. That's the pool that militants swim in. Yes, the radicals want to do it violently, but the end game is the same whether they want to do it by democracy or violently, and that end game is the Islamic State or political Islam. So ultimately, this has a Sunni and a Shia version. On the left there is the Sunni version, Muslim Brotherhood. Qardawi is one of the imams. Their mantra when they were running Egypt for a year in the Arab awakening after the Egyptian revolution remained the same. Their jihadist symbolization did not change as they were elected democratically. They still wanted to promote jihad and dying in the way of Allah. The Shia movement that runs Iran now is taking over Iraq, has taken over Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and now controls Syria. You see now 4 countries, as Prime Minister Netanyahu mentioned yesterday in his speech to Congress, have been gobbled up by the Shia radicals of Iran. This is an Islamist movement. It believes in the supremacy of the Islamic State. There's virtually no difference other than the sectarian divisions between Shia and Sunni between the Islamic State in Iran or the Islamic State of Saudi Arabia and ISIS. So when you look at the numbers, we can say Al-Qaeda are these little cells and little groups, but the ideology of bin Laden or ISIS, the reason these groups are fusing, we saw just yesterday reports that Boko Haram in Nigeria is using the same technology as ISIS in Syria and Iraq, the same source technology to make their videos. So therefore they're working together. Boko Haram is a Nigerian Islamist radical group, had very little contact with ISIS, and yet they're using the same technology, people. So this is where our groups need to work together to figure out, they come together because they have the same mission. So ultimately, we have to be able to counter these ideas across the Middle East. our organization is based on promoting liberty, that is the solution to counter-radicalization and countering the Islamist narrative. It's not about Islam, but it is about Islamism or the Islamic State. And you can't over-mention and the importance of talking about women's rights movements. We saw here in Phoenix, Noor al-Maliki was assassinated by her father because he violated the premise of honor for the family, of the Islamic values that he felt needed to be part of it. And, you know, I will tell you that honor violence and honor killings are to women's rights in Islamic communities the same thing that terrorism is to the political movement of the Islamic State. Tip of the iceberg of a much bigger problem of gender apartheid. Lastly, you know, this is sort of a picture of all the leaders of Islamic countries. To those of us doing the reform work on the front lines, to me this is sort of the evil empire. And I don't say that as a anti-Islamic thing. I say it actually as pro-Islamic. These are autocrats, monarchs, dictators that in their jails are Muslims who want to be free. They are fueling the radicalization of their communities and the world through billions of petrodollars. They come together and form this organization of Islamic cooperation, which is a voting bloc in the UN. And their ideas that they spread are the ones that are fueling the radicalizations of our Muslims here in America. So they may claim to be our allies, but ultimately this is a bipartisan problem. All administrations, presidential libraries, universities are funded by many of these governments that ultimately are apologists and will not confront the ideas. And I don't need to list off for you the litany of terror attacks from Fort Hood after 9/11 to Boston. Now the trial for the Boston bombers just started today. And last, what I want to leave you with is two things. This is sort of a list of all the ideas that need reform, but I think if you begin to understand it, free speech is one of them. You may have seen, obviously, after the Paris assassinations of the magazine cartoonists, the front lines went from our military to the parliament in Ottawa. Our governments are front lines, to media now have been exposed as front lines because they insulted the Prophet. And yet theologically in Islam, insulting God is a bigger sin, but the reason they're so offended at the insult of the Prophet Muhammad is because of this Islamopatriotism. Muhammad is what us Muslims hold dear that no other faith does, versus God is shared. We share the same God as Christianity and Judaism, so that's not going to be something these radicals are going to pick out. They're going to pick out an offense of Muhammad because they want to unify the community in this Islamopatriotism, if you will. And there are so many other fronts in this fight. It's all about identity. Which team do you bond with? The jihadists are on the field, and in the audience are those that basically cheer them on, and then outside the stadium are Muslims that we're trying to wake up because they've been silent, and you can't counter these ideas unless you begin to wake up communities. These are some of the organizations that exist today. This ad we ran on January 11th, it was signed by 24 organizations that we would consider to be Muslim reformers. It was based on, I know you can't read it, but basically it lists women's leaders, feminists, Muslim liberals that believe that there should be a separation of mosque and state. This group, none of these groups were invited to the White House on the Conference of Violent Extremism. This is a problem. The U.S. government does not want to weigh in the battle within the House of Islam. So in exchange, it's working with lobbyists and apologists for those governments that basically say it's just a terror problem. We're working with the Saudis against the militants. We don't want to deal with the Islamic reform issue. That is a problem, and I think will hamper our local security also. My last few minutes, if you looked at the entire population of Muslims, let's say this is the 1.5 billion people. On each side of this population is the extreme violent extremists, 5 to 10% of the population. On the right is the theocratic mindset, those who believe in the Islamic State. On the left are the secular ones that don't believe in Sharia or Islamic law and government, but are secular. Both sides have militant, violent extremists. Perfect example is the Palestinian movement. You've got Hamas, that the theocrats, and then the PLO or Fatah that are secular. They both use terror as a means to get to the ends. In the middle are the normal, moderate Muslims that don't believe in violence. That is 90% of the Muslim population. Every Muslim I've met falls in that nonviolent, moderate middle. But the issue is the pool that feeds into the militant component is an Islamic State movement, and I guess this pointer doesn't work on the screen, but these guys have been winning, and gals have been winning elections. They won an election in Egypt. They won an election in Tunisia. They are huge movements in Pakistan, etc. And those are political Islamists that believe in the Islamic State but don't believe in it as a militant component but as a state democratically. If you're going to defeat and drain that pool, the way to do it, as I have in the center here, is by promoting freedom and liberty, separation of mosque and state. Unless we get involved in that whole debate and continuum, we're not going to be able to protect our country. And it's all about Islamo-patriotism. I want to leave this slide up. It was counter-radicalization work done by NYPD. The NYPD got under a lot of heat because of its approach to try to understand the radicalization process. Many of these groups that consider our group to be an antagonist have tried actually a month ago, because of certain partisan-type battles that happened. This report is on the verge of being removed, even though it was central to the counterterrorism work being done. And they added a page to make it clear that, just because you're a pious Muslim doesn't make you a radical, and I'm testimony to that. I not only love my faith, but have helped a number of mosques be built, but we also take radicalization seriously. So I would ask you to download this report. It's 40 pages before the government removes it because of political correctness, and I hope basically we can work together to try to understand that in this component of counterterrorism, nobody wants to sacrifice freedoms in the name of security, but you also want to be vigilant and understand where the threat is coming from. And if we don't understand where that threat is, you're going to waste a ton of Arizona taxpayers' money and federal money on programs that are not focusing on where the problem's coming from. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jasser. And I think in your report that you just gave us was probably 100 times more effective than the so-called conference that just took place for these last few days, where they can't even say the words radical Islam. Quick question before members have any questions, if they have any. In Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech yesterday, he mentioned Iran and ISIS may be fighting each other, and the enemy of my enemy is my enemy. Thank you, Colonel Molstead and family. Do you agree with that notion that Iran, A, is the largest sponsor of terrorism in the world, and how do you view their fighting with ISIS? Is it just, as Prime Minister Netanyahu said, just a Game of Thrones, so to speak, between the two of them?
Well, I have to tell you first, as I will tell you a personal bias is I'm of Syrian origin. My family escaped Syria in the 60s, so to see the genocide happening against Sunni Muslims, especially in Syria, that has happened, and to see Syria annexed by Iran, I have a particular stake in this, as my family's dodging Assad's bombs and dodging the radicals of ISIS in Syria, in Aleppo and Damascus, my direct family that is mostly still there. I will tell you also that, let's first start with Syria on answering that question. And by the way, tonight at the Walter Cronkite School, there is a panel that the Arizona Republic is organizing on Syria, the most dangerous country in the world, that starts at 6:30, so anybody who's interested. The first year of the Syrian conflict, the revolution, there was no ISIS. There was no Al-Qaeda. They were in jails in Syria. We forget that Assad, who is a Shia of Shia origin, works very closely with Iran and claims that the Sunnis are against him militantly because of their religious issues, but really the revolution started as a political one. Then, per the Arab Tyrant 101 manual, as he found himself cornered in a very diverse revolution, he started releasing Al-Qaeda from jails. He then bombed the moderate neighborhoods and left northeastern Syria, where the militants were starting to corner. He left them alone. And all I would ask you is look at the bombing patterns and how Syria looks from a satellite image. The areas where ISIS is are almost being left scot-free. The West has been necessary to bomb ISIS. Why? He left them alone, in which the Wall Street Journal called an entente with them, because just as the Saudis left Al-Qaeda alone for a while, just as Mubarak left the Muslim Brotherhood alone, these dictators leave radicals alone so that they can legitimize military control of their population and not deal with liberty reforms for democracy. So, having said that, what happens is ISIS is this creation that he allowed to exist that then metastasized into Iraq, grew, and started to create its own state. Iran has, Stephen Hayes reported about Iran, as much as it is against the Sunni radicals, has actually now been proven to be fueling some of these militant movements because it also serves their purposes. The war in Syria, at the end of the day, we have to decimate ISIS. You found now recently Iran went into Tikrit just a few days ago and has been helping a country that we helped liberate and now is under basically Iranian control, that ultimately they have been countering ISIS supposedly with the same enemy, but they are also our enemy. Iran is a global fuel, the primary fuel for terrorism, not only with Hezbollah, with a lot of militant groups, including Al-Qaeda. So the intersecting circles are on very many. The primary guide for Iran is the advancement, imperialist spread of radical Islam under a Shia banner. And as Prime Minister Netanyahu said yesterday, it's a game of thrones. The battle is between who wants to sit in that throne. The ideology, be it Sunni or Shia, is the same.
Thank you. Members, questions for Dr. Jasser? Senator Burgess.
Dr. Jasser, could you email us your link to this report, please?
Oh, this report? Absolutely.
Yes. Thank
If you can, I can even send you the report itself if you want.
And Dr. Jasser, one more question. I remember listening to a presentation of yours several years ago, and I believe you had I think it was a Yemeni professor that said, if only we can get, and I think they called him some martyr, to walk through the Arizona tunnels, they would be able to decimate, I think the number was the tens of thousands at once. Do you know what I'm referring to? I think he was a professor that spoke to an organization, to a group, but he was specifically referencing the open border of the United States as a way to strike America, be it by a suitcase nuke or something like that. But and I apologize, it's been a few years since I've seen it, but is that rhetoric alive and well in some of those terrorist nations where they are actively looking to pursue what could be holes in our security system, i.e. the border, to inflict harm?
They will look at every weakness possible in order to exploit it. And as that professor mentioned, the border is one of those, and in many ways, be it the Canadian or the Mexican border, they will find vulnerabilities. We just saw last week, I would ask you to look at Adam Credo's report a few days ago in the Washington Beacon, Free Beacon, in which he talked about the cutting that our telecommunications lines that were cut in southern Arizona that sacrificed, I think, a quarter of our population's telecom for a few hours, was done by hackers, and that could be done by terrorists, and could have a huge impact upon us. And they do this, and let me connect it to the radical theology. To them, ISIS, their first goal was to get them into Syria to oust Assad, oust the West, anti-Zionist, anti-Western mentality to try to create this caliphate. Now they're realizing that we're not letting any Muslims, especially Syrians and others, leave to go, or anyone that wants to help the jihad leave. So now they're sending messages through their magazine called Dabak, which is a little town in Syria that supposedly in the 15th century was part of the eschatology or end of times theology, that battle in Dabak between the Christians and Islam, when it would be won by Muslims, would be the beginning of the end of time in which the world would be under Islamic control. Well, that magazine every month has things like that in it about, for example, the killing of the magazine artist in Paris was projected in that magazine, that kill those who ridicule the Prophet, etc. It became a license. They're saying if you can't come to the Middle East, do your terror, do your attacks for God in the states, in the country that you are. So basically telling them to do it in Minnesota and Arizona or Florida or wherever they are. So that threat is very real, and it has increased significantly, which has led to, we saw some of the acts, the beheading in Oklahoma, the act in London, the act in Ottawa. I mean, this is like, these aren't unrelated. Even the word lone wolf really frustrates me because Americans hear that and they think, oh, these guys aren't related. They're not related any more than the Ebola virus that was in Dallas is unrelated to the Ebola virus in Liberia or elsewhere where it started. So these are connected. they're transmitted with similar types of ideas, and the clerics drive that. It's basically, as this report talks about, that final stage is a spiritual sanctioner that gives them the sense that this will be their key to heaven. So you have to watch that, and especially as a border state where they're trying to enter into our country, because at the end of the day, Senator, what they want to do is their first goal is to make America inhospitable to Muslims so that Muslims don't feel that this is their country. So this concept of anti-Americanism, that America is bigoted against Muslims, becomes something they want to feed. Second is to try to make us lock ourselves up, make it no different than a dictatorship, and ultimately find vulnerabilities so that we get, I mean, look at 9/11 cost Al-Qaeda $500,000, and it cost us $1 trillion plus. So this is the economics of it for them too.
And last question for me, is when we speak about 9/11, wasn't one of the first maybe Al-Qaeda camps near or in Tucson where they actually started learning, where they were in those pilot simulator programs? Can you speak about any Al-Qaeda presence on or before 2011 in Arizona that might have led to?
There was one of the
9/11.
primary Taliban, pro-Taliban magazines based out of Tucson, which had a lot of this ideology about radical Islam and counter-Americanism and the threat of America and Zionist conspiracies, etc., was published right out of southern Arizona there. So, this all was shut down, obviously, and confronted post 9/11, but we have to understand that locally some of these things are real. And it doesn't always just, Al-Qaeda is a militant group that has declared war on America back in 1998, actually. Now it's morphed into ISIS. It's ISIS in Libya now is joining with the other Al-Qaeda type groups. So don't be, we were, I think, a bit complacent in 2007, 2008, in which we said, well, Al-Qaeda was decimated, it's over. The ideology was thriving. It has grown post-Arab awakening because of these vacuums that are getting filled by autocratic regimes. I will tell you one little anecdote. If you look 4 or 5 months ago, I got into a public conflagration with a professor at ASU who had written a piece comparing our troops to ISIS and saying that the rape done against women and other things by American troops in Iraq and others, and he used Abu Ghraib and other things to compare that, was similar to what ISIS did to enslave women, etc. And as much as he wasn't advocating violence, I held that up as an example that when you have a Muslim professor publishing this in the West, that becomes a primary tool for our enemies to say that this is why America is anti-Islam and this is why you want to come and join the Islamic State. So, that was right out of the University of Arizona.
Well, Dr. Jasser, again, I want to thank you for your time. I know that, at least I believe that your safety has been threatened in terms of how much you speak out against these issues. And I want to say, thank you to you and your organization for the work that you're doing. Please continue to keep it up. And again, once more, thank you for fitting us into your schedule. I appreciate the update.
Thank you.
Members, any further questions? Thank you, Dr. Jasser. Much appreciated. Thank you, sir.